I mean, I can take a first comment,
Hmm.
Burkhard. I think you had mentioned this
Excellent.
issue of apologies and how systems
Yeah.
that apologize imply more trust. I think that's definitely a question worth studying because I have to say my personal experience with systems that like ChatGPT and others that will
Hmm.
constantly make mistakes, at which point I will correct them and which they will apologize and then continue to make
Hmm.
mistakes, only gets me more annoyed, not
Yeah.
less, and less likely to trust them and
Yeah.
not more. But I agree this is a question that, what are the devices through which we engender trust and what mechanisms are useful to build that kind of trust?
Yeah. Absolutely. We have a raised hand I hear from the audience. Amanda?
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for the great interventions. I had a question. I saw that more than one speaker has spoken about the dichotomy of fairness and privacy. It reminds me a little bit of the discussion of regulation versus innovation, and I am increasingly wondering if this is a narrative that is possibly pushed by the industry rather than what is technically possible. I was wondering whether the any of the panelists has any thoughts whether it's a true dichotomy that we accept or is one that we should challenge as a field to pursue both objectives such as privacy and explainability. And I'm also referring a little bit around, the counterfactual explanations that I think Burkhard and David, you started speaking about, whether there are other forms of desirable levels of informational transparency where we anonymize data while allowing those that are affected to understand how their data is being processed to achieve a different form of meaningful transparency while preserving privacy. And well, I personally agree that there might be specific scenarios where that dichotomy holds true. I'm wondering whether if current architectures are not allowing for this to be true, for instance, the transformer architectures, where we accept that it's not a good decision support system, I am wondering whether we should be pushing for alternative architectures that are more based on symbolic approaches. So I don't know if anyone is able to and happy to address this. Thank you.
Excellent. So we already moved into the next round. And Suresh, you want to take that one on?
I'll address the question on privacy and fairness
Uh-huh.
and the perceived dichotomy. I mean, so I think, Amanda, you're not wrong to point out that some of the rhetoric around this is coming from interests and vested interests in the space. A paper we wrote, my student and I wrote, and colleagues wrote recently, talked about how privacy enhancing technologies are used. So privacy enhancing technologies are used as a way to say, we can collect data from you, but because it's privacy enhancing, we won't know anything about it. But what that just does is actually build up of even more intrusive and excessively surveillant data collection infrastructure with the pretext that it'll be privacy preserving. But in practice, all that means is that it increases the amount of surveillance that companies can do on you because they can look at a lot of data in aggregate, even though your personal information may not be revealed. So the effects and the impacts on communities and peoples at large are increased, even though it looks like your data is not being revealed. So this idea of privacy as a tool for alleviating these problems becomes problematic because then it's used as a rhetorical device to do even more surveillance. On the question of privacy versus fairness or privacy and fairness, I think that also is it's a confusion caused by a misconception of where the locus of responsibility lies. If we talk about why privacy is important, one way to argue is that we don't want our data to be used in ways that could be harmful to us. And that use is important because, for example, if a private company is collecting my data and is using it in a particular way, we may be concerned about the use, for example, to say decide who to hire. We might be concerned they're using information about me that they shouldn't be using to decide whether to give me a job. Now, if a regulator whom I might trust wants to go and investigate this company and needs to get access to data to determine this, then my privacy concern is not with the regulator necessarily, but with the company. And I'd be perhaps more willing to let the regulator look at some of my data to determine whether I'm being discriminated against or not in this particular case. And so some of the perceived dichotomy between privacy and fairness, I think, fails to recognize that there are different actors and different responsibilities and different stakeholders, and who we want the data to be private from, and who we want to make sure that our data is used in a responsible way, often are very different. And we need to think about that a bit more carefully.
Excellent. Thanks. And there will be ways to get back to that answer, Suresh, as well. I'm going to hold my mouth here at this point, because otherwise we are going to be here for the rest of the hour. But I think David was the next one who raised his hand before, and then we move on to Anne.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think the first thing I'd want to push back on is I just actually don't really see the tension between privacy and fairness. We know that there are plenty of cases where, in fact, to have a fairer model, we need to not know certain information about people. That if you include information, you actually, especially in underrepresented groups, will cause the performance of the system to go down if you know that they're in the because you're just you're stratifying your data in a more fine-grained way, and that can lead to actually worse performance. So it's not even this sort of simple fairness by ignorance kind of idea. It's just actually sometimes the best thing to have a fair system is for people to not reveal certain kinds of information. So I confess that that one strikes me as straightforward, but I wanted to connect to something Suresh was saying, which is that when we think about privacy, I think it's important, certainly here in the United States, for us to move beyond the simplistic view that some people have in the US of data as a property right, as a thing that you can own and sell, perhaps in return for access to a service, and start shifting towards much more of a use-based conception of privacy. I kind of don't care who has a lot of the different kinds of data about me, as long as they can't do things that undermine my autonomy, that harm my interests, that prevent me from being able to take advantage of goods to which I have legitimate rights and access. So we need to shift to that. And I think the same thing goes with, you also raised the question of explainability. When we think about explainability, we need to think about, why do we want explainability? What are we trying to use the system to do? My own view is that many, perhaps even most of the techniques we've developed for explainable AI essentially answer the wrong question. They answer the question of causally, how does this black box work? But I think almost always when we want explanations, we want to know, why is the black box giving me the right answer? And knowing the internal causal structure doesn't help me know the rightness or correctness of the answer of that's produced by that causal structure. Rightness and correctness is an external explanation, not an internal one. So I think that one of the challenges we have is there are, I don't know, 27 different features that people have tossed out as really important or essential for AI systems. But until you know the use, until you know the context, it's very hard to know which ones of these actually matter, what it means for them to matter, and how we might implement a system in a way that supports them. But that kind of information, companies have a vested interest in saying, no, we have a general purpose system. It can be used everywhere for everything, which is antithetical to the idea I'm suggesting.
I think that also directly relates to what AI4People was trying to do. We started in 2017, when the big problem were things like Compass, where we dealt with AI systems that had one specific purpose, and it was relatively straightforward to know what they were expected to do and not expected to do. And then directly towards the end of the AI Act, already being more or less agreed, generative AI comes up, the general models, the foundation models come up, and the parliament rushes into some necessary but probably not quite as thought through amendments to the Act to cover also systems where we don't know in advance what the operating rules are. And I think, again, reflecting on quite a lot of things others have said before now, my approach probably would be to say they don't have a purpose. They are literature devices, literature writing devices, where you can't ask, as you just said, is there an external reality that corresponds to them? It's story narrative coherence more than anything else that we might be able to spot. Anne, you were the next on the list.
Yeah. Thank you, Burkhard. Well, thank you for your question, Amanda, and your comments. I guess I would say human beings tend to put things sometimes in these dichotomies and sort of create these tensions as a way of having people pick sides, as a way of advancing a certain agenda. The Markle Center is in Silicon Valley, and so we're surrounded by people who are continually trying to position things in certain ways. You talked about this tension between regulation and innovation, for example, is one of those paradigms that people put out there, as if you have to make a choice between the two. Certainly, that's kind of the techno-optimist, wants you to believe that if you have some kind of regulation, it will somehow impede innovation, when we know from other industries and how they've developed that regulations can often help things to move more quickly, and to help people, once there's a regulatory framework that's present, a liability framework, when people can see who's going to be held accountable for certain acts and actions within an industry, that clarifies for people what should be done and how those decisions should be made. But I also want to say, humans, as long as they're still involved in the process of making the decisions around this, try and solve these problems, try and go to how can we resolve these tensions if we perceive them. There is all this work, this technical solution that I referenced that is not my area of specialty, but I admire those who have come to identify differential privacy practices, for example, which are ways of infusing statistical noise to make it difficult to identify any given individual's data in a data set, but don't impede group level analysis. Might reduce its accuracy, but still allows it to happen. Distributes it on different devices. Federated statistics is that part of differentially federated statistics, private federated statistics, which uses discrete individual systems or devices where analysis can be performed, so that instead of sending large volumes of user data to a central server, data scientists can send queries to individual devices and still receive an aggregate report back that allows them to identify trends across groups. So there are mechanisms people have started to develop to try and solve when people put these different tensions or dichotomies out there and say these can't be resolved. I think our tendency is to try and still protect both privacy and fairness, and hold them as values that we want to advance.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts.
Thanks a lot, Anne. Are there at this point any other comments from the audience, from the wider membership that is with us today, so that we in the panel do not monopolize too much the discussion? Anyone? For me, just to explain a little bit why I think that there is sometimes a tension between fairness and data protection. One of the things pretty much all of you came back on and said you don't quite believe in that. There was this American case a couple of years back. Husband and wife individually apply for a credit card. They know of each other exactly their credit rating, their income, everything. So they were really, really surprised when he got the credit card and she didn't, because they knew that she was earning more, that they both had excellent credit rating, that pretty much everything was the same, and those things that differed all differed in her favor. And that knowledge, knowing that the other received something that they didn't, that allowed them then to make that challenge and to say, look, something is going wrong here. You claim that your decision was following the rules. Maybe they did, but as a system, as a bank, you are very clearly giving preferential treatment here to the male of the species. So that was, for me, I think, the starting point to think about a conflict between fairness and data protection, privacy, that even if the AI was able to give a valid reason why her credit card application was refused, it would not have been able to give also a valid reason why her husband's was accepted. But you only know that if you know what the other person was doing. So it might be that AI technology ensures or could ensure that that type of problem doesn't happen. I can't see it personally, but then I'm good old-fashioned AI trained in the 1990s. I still believe in symbolic reasoning systems. For them, it would be really difficult. So I'm just wondering, given that type of scenario, how your analysis would factor that one in. Do I have an ability to interrogate a system what it would have done for people that are like me apart from one of the irrelevant or prohibited parameters? David?
I mean, I think that this goes partially to something that Suresh was talking about, which is I don't know that I need to have the ability to do it, but somebody ought to have the ability to do it. And that somebody ought not be solely the company who has designed and developed the algorithm. They have all kinds of conflicts of interest that will prevent them from assessing that correctly or sensibly. I do want to say, I think there's a really important difference, though, between assessing that it would have been different if some irrelevant attribute versus some prohibited attribute, because that's shifting, if it's an irrelevant attribute that we change and yet it made a difference, there's a bit of all right, something went wrong here in the design of the system. That's something that should be fixable. The problematic cases, of course, with fairness and bias are where there's a prohibited attribute, something that we ought not, whether legally or morally, pay attention to, and yet is carrying information about the long run predictive information in the particular society, culture, historical practices that we exist in, right? I'm not saying that there's something inherently different, but that was part of you mentioned Compass. That was part of the challenge of Compass, is precisely that. In fact, there were these correlations. Now, they weren't as strong as they made a lot of mistakes with the way they built the model, but it is in fact the case that in America, if you are Black versus white, all else held equal, you are more likely to be arrested later. I mean, that simply is an empirical truth about the current practices in the US. So that's where I think the tensions really arise. And that's where I think we have to be very careful about how you assess the kinds of counterfactuals you're talking about, because they aren't as simple as, well, if I had been a woman, if I'd been a woman, many other things in my life would have been very different. And how do we assess these gets into, the philosopher in me is very excited about these questions. The technologist in me is terrified of these questions. And so I think that's really where we have to, those are the ones that I think are the most difficult to work out and probably should not be left in the hands of the company. Well,
Yeah.
definitely should not be left in the hands of companies alone.
Yeah, I mean, I was exactly thinking of what Suresh was saying, and you were also hinting at that some of these decisions, the aggregate comparison, might be best left to a regulator, and we might still feel sufficiently confident to share our data with the regulator to make that sort of assessment rather than the company or leaving it entirely to our own. Andreas, you were next in line.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on something that I think is a kind of more general problem behind what you described in that case, in which I think it was Apple, and it took them, I think, several months before they could address that. And this more general point is that not only within the field of AI, but many more current advanced technologies, it becomes more difficult for us to say whether they work or broken, or what should happen if they work or are broken, or to what degree. There are many wonderful examples for that, but classical technologies in many ways don't give us the same challenge. If I press on the light switch, I get an immediate effect whether it works or not. And this is not the same in many contexts of AI use, but also beyond AI. And this leads actually to our question of trust and trustworthiness, because we are not very capable in many cases to say whether it works or to what degree it actually works. And therefore, we need experts in order to do that. I just quickly want to give you an example. What are the practical challenges in order to assess trustworthiness? I was once involved in a project in a medical context in radio oncology. And the challenge is quite similar in the sense that patients there, they don't perceive the effects of the procedure immediately. There's a strong beam, but you can't see that, you can't taste it, you hear a lot of noise, but you are not sure whether your cancer cells are actually impacted by that or what is happening. It's very imperceptible. And still, your life is at risk in this moment. So when we spoke with psycho-oncologists, one told me that some patients, because they don't know how to assess whether they are getting the best treatment, and they sit together in the waiting area, and then they start to compare, oh, you get 25 times these sessions. I get it only 20. Am I in a better position, or do I get worse treatment? So when they start to think about, can I trust my medical professionals that they give me the best treatment, the psycho-oncologist said sometimes patients may look at the shoes of the doctor and think they are dirty. How can I trust them? And I think this is the point of the practical challenges where we need experts in order to think about how trustworthy AI models work, but then we have to think whether can we trust the experts. And this is the kind of network we are in. And this is why some of you pointed out we need strong institutions. But then we need trust and justified trust into these institutions. And I think this is really the practical, not mess, just reality of the networks of trust we have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks, Hein. It really reminds me of the building next to mine here in Edinburgh at the moment, the formerly so-called David Hume Tower, where you have on the one hand the Enlightenment that says, oh, we don't believe any longer in authority, and it's your own experiments that count. And very, very quickly you realize, no, it can't quite work like that. We can't all start anew. We have to trust our teachers. We have to trust the right form of expert. So the question, who is the right expert, rather than expertise versus something else, becomes the sort of dominating discussion. Suresh, you were on the list.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm very glad Andreas mentioned the light bulb, because I want to bring this back to a point that Anne had made earlier about innovation versus regulation. Andreas mentioned you can turn on the light bulb and it just works. It's not like AI. Well, there's a reason that happens. And, I grew up in India with a lot of voltage fluctuation. You could not always assume that when you put the light bulb on, that it wouldn't just blow up because of voltage fluctuation. And we had to have stabilizers on our large appliances to make sure we had steady electrical supply to them. The reason you can put the light bulb on and expect that it works is because A, there's an electrical grid which produces voltage within a particular specification as specified by regulators for that process. B, there are standards and practices for light bulbs to be built in a certain way and tested in a certain way. And C, there's electrical systems in the house that are under severe rules. Electricians have to come in and make your system up to code so all your wiring is appropriate and sends the right signals so that when you put that switch on, the light bulb just goes on. In other words, there's an entire apparatus of regulation, to Anne's point, that allows innovation to happen, allows us to have fancy light bulbs that are motions controlled or Wi-Fi controlled or so on. It doesn't happen by accident. There's an invisible architecture of regulation and institutional trust that gives us this. I mean, and Andreas mentioned, medicine, and I'm thinking of COVID and how the science did not change during COVID. What happened was a breakdown in trust in institutions and institutional leaders that led people to have, strong divisions about their belief in vaccines, and what we're seeing in the US now with belief in vaccines, with belief in medicine broadly. The science has not changed. Our trust in institutions has changed. And I think that's where we have to remember that even with AI, we keep talking about trust in AI. What we need to have and what we don't have are the institutional structures that make us feel confident that when an entity uses an AI tool, that it comes within the same institutional level of trust that we've had for other systems in the past. And I feel very strongly about it.
Which of course poses a problem that some people who push AI also push decentralized systems that say we don't need institutions, we just need to do it by ourselves, and that then reinforces almost that problem that you identified. Anne?
Yeah, I want to keep on this same theme and kind of go back to Andreas's example around the doctors and the patients. My husband's a cancer patient and was originally diagnosed with a pretty advanced form of cancer. And one of his first responses to that was, I'm going to trust in science, right? I'm going to believe that the medical profession can come up with solutions. They're advancing all the time. My work is to just stay alive long enough for those advancements to catch up with my illness and be able to treat it more effectively than it's treating it right now. And that comes from a network of beliefs that the medical profession has adopted. The sort of the development of bioethics in the middle of the last century, a set of standards and practices that as technologies, new discoveries were being unearthed, the medical profession was able to come together and say, okay, we need some new ways of thinking about this, and to talk about malfeasance and non-malfeasance and benefits and those principles. Again, I'm back to principles that underlie the decisions that are going to be made in a certain industry. And business has really struggled. Medicine had the Hippocratic Oath, right? Every doctor already was used to making a certain profession a certain obligation towards their profession. And business has struggled to bring forward a similar set of credentials or practices or oaths or beliefs that serve the common good towards those kinds of ends. So we haven't seen that kind of broad industry-wide adoption of a set of ethical practices that people can have some confidence in. And I think we need that, and regulation helps that, but so too does the coming together of industry. And large players in industry and investors in industry can make a difference by adopting some self-governance. I mean, that's effectively what bioethics became, was a set of self-governance practices that allow people to have confidence in medicine.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, you're absolutely right, and the importance of the institutional level here, and how we can strengthen our institutions to make AI work is I think, extremely important. Andreas?
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify on one point related to what Suresh just mentioned. There is in this example, this whole set of institutions behind you when you turn on the light bulb. That's correct, and that's exactly right about that. I think what is different, and what I wanted to point to, is that we don't necessarily can perceive the effect and judge whether it's correct or not in the case of AI, in many cases at least. In the case of light bulbs, I get an immediate experience whether it works or not. And I can leave the background of institutions that work for that it works for me in the background. Regarding privacy, I don't perceive necessarily what data is used or taken from me. And in many cases, I even don't know whether the main function of a model is working properly or to what degree it does. I need experts for that. And so this is not just about the background of institutions, this is also the foreground of institutions in assessing whether it works, not just making it work.
Which in a way reminds me to the old problem we have if you speak to your medical doctor, to your GP, and they will tell you, you can reduce your chances of cancer or liver disease by stopping drinking by 20%. And I stop drinking and I do not get that illness, but I do sometimes wonder, didn't I get it because I stopped drinking, Or would I have been in the lucky bunch of people who can drink and still don't get liver problems? So I think we have exactly the same, very often at least, the same problem here of predicting something that only happens with certain percentages. And that does require also changes to the way we use AI systems to essentially do very, very similar things. Roger Kirby?
Yeah, I wanted to pick up something on that Anna had mentioned, if that was okay, when she was talking about the difficulties in terms of uh, having like a singular group of principles that's all encompassing and that's very much kind of trying to get companies to sort of buy into them and sort of run with them. I guess what I was trying to think was that got me thinking about was the fact that we live in an age of social media. AI is available at our fingertips. There's, you only have to scream fake news, and everybody sort of just, oh well, it's just we don't believe it. There's a lack of trust, and that trust is kind of almost accepted by the public now as part and parcel of the day-to-day world in which we live in. Does that make it harder for companies, given the fact that there is that lack of sort of bottom-up pressure? We kind of just accept it now as a population, and that it's very much top down in terms of where that pressure for trust and fairness and all of those good things that we talk about with responsible AI coming from.
Thanks a lot, Roger. That was a direct question for Anne, and she has raised her hand. Excellent. Good
Yeah.
discipline.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I mean, I accept that people have started to just accept certain things in society, like lower trust. I wrote a piece just recently about the way that politicians are using artificial intelligence and how their own application of it to develop satirical kind of representations of their opponents or people that they disagree with really erodes trust in society overall, trust in our elected officials and the people who should be representing us. But I don't think we should accept that. Just because it's the case that society has gotten more numb to some of these realities doesn't mean that we are off the hook. If we're going to accept leadership positions in society, in industry, in academia, and other in technology and other ways, then we still have an obligation to try and foster a sense of trust, because trust is a common good. It is part of what makes society work. Money is trust, right? It is the belief that if I give you this dollar or whatever the currency is that you're using, that it will hold its value long enough for us to make the transaction that we're in the process of making. And so if you start to lose your confidence in some of these fundamental things that represent the trust that we have in society, it can't function. And so I think that's what a lot of, public sentiment that is being captured in all the polling that's being done. And, there's a fairly consistent, widespread lack of confidence in the future that AI is offering us, a belief that it is not going to be a trustworthy AI-enabled future, because there is not the confidence in the technology right now that you would expect to see. If it was really this fascinating, new, exciting technology, everybody else would be appreciating it as such. And the levels of appreciation are so demarcated in our society. It is really only the people who are building these models and see their potential for solving, often in cases very narrow applications, are having the greatest early success, that have the confidence in AI that you would expect to see if it was being accepted broadly. So I don't think we can't just accept that erosion of trust. We need to do something about it.
Yeah. Suresh, you are.
I just wanted to violently agree with Anne in that it is, while it is correct that we have lost a degree of trust, we cannot accept that as the way it needs to be, and we also to recognize that there are powerful actors who are exploiting that lack of trust for their own ends. I like to say that I'm a card-carrying computer scientist, but what I mean by that is that I feel like it is part of my responsibility as someone who allegedly has the skills and the knowledge to build these systems to think about ways we can build differently, the ways we can, how do we build back trust? What can we do with technical and socio-technical and institutional artifacts to help build back trust? What can our tools do for us differently than the tools that are being presented to us are offering us? I think the public has, and as Anne points out, the public is sensing that what's being offered to us as a bill of goods is a little questionable, and that I think people are looking for something different, looking for alternatives, and it's not all of our jobs, at least jobs for people like me, to provide alternatives that are trustworthy, that can engender more trust, and we should be working hard on that.
Yeah, I know. In a way, reflecting what Anne and you were saying, I don't think the world will perish because there's a super AI that will decide it doesn't like humans and acts on it. The world will perish because some mid-ranking bureaucrat decides that a really, really crappy system is exactly what we need to run the national health system or nuclear deterrent, and then it fails exactly in the way that we would have predicted it. So I think your emphasis on building the right sort of trust in the human institution that then enable the meaningful deployment of AI is really important. And
yeah, just one other quick point about leadership. My area is leadership ethics, and I look at leadership and business ethics, and there are such vast implications for leadership in the future that AI is bringing forward. There's the reality that if we eliminate all these entry-level positions, we're not building the pipeline of future leadership that we're going to need for all kinds of decisions. So there's that sort of on the ground impact of artificial intelligence that we're already seeing in the workplace choices that are being made by companies. But what I really want to emphasize is the kind of leader that we need to shepherd us into a future where AI is going to be as pervasive as so many are predicting it will be, is going to require a different set of skills. And one of those skills is going to be around developing and trust and trustworthiness, giving people a sense that the choices that institutions are making, whether they're companies or other organizations, are in the best interests of people. And that's why I say some of the principles that we need to be advancing need to be more explicitly about serving humanity, more explicitly human-centered than some of the principles that are, that you see that show up on each of the company's different lists. And those principles are great: accountability, transparency, explainability, all those things. But we also need the things that get directly to long-term building long-term institutions, sort of those things that are investing in humanity broadly as leadership skills that we value in the leader that we're going to need for the future.
I'm wondering about one thing just occurred to me. Long time ago, I had to look into the origin of this notion of informed consent of the patient in medical law. And those of you, please, if I'm saying something wrong here, immediately shoot me down. It's a long time, and I only really had to do it to double check a footnote, but immediately fell down a small rabbit hole. Some people were saying this is a very, very new principle. This sort of patient-centric, you decide, you have to be fully informed about your therapy, and then you make all the relevant decisions. It's relatively recent. Others were saying, no, this is an old medical principle that goes back at least to the 19th century, and the professionalization of the legal, the medical discussion. And when I dug a little bit deeper, and that's where I stopped more or less, was to say, well, both are right, because this earlier concept of informed consent was something your medical doctor as a professional decided was good for you for that specific treatment. So they would decide, can you cope with that information? They would decide what amount of information do I tell you. If they think that that you were unreliable, they would just make stuff up in the hope that you still follow the instruction. If they felt that you needed to understand what was going on, they would tell you more. But it was their professional decision rather than you are right. And that changed around the 1970s, 60s, 70s, and the 20th century, right to this model now, where I often feel when I go to my GP, look, you're the expert, just tell me what I'm supposed to be doing. Don't give me all these choices. I want just your opinion here. I don't want two different risk trees, which are extremely difficult. And I'm wondering where also for AI the right level is here. I would still feel abused, and I wouldn't trust an AI system that tries to manipulate me as gently as the traditional medical professional of the 19th century was. But I also don't want to be left with all the responsibility, given that I'm not an expert in many of the system questions that I'm using in AI. So I don't know. It's really my very open question to you. And I got two hands, one from David, from Joe, and I think David was the first in very, very quickly.
I think I was the first, but I've talked several times and Joe hasn't had the opportunity, so I'm happy to allow him to go first. Oh, okay. For me, much is going to depend on what information and evidence I have that, in the case of the AI, that it has my best interests at heart. I've had doctors that actually, I don't want them to just tell me what they want me to do because I don't actually think they understand what matters to me. If I'm using a system built by a large tech company that has a history of being extractive about people's data and information, no, I'm probably not going to trust it. If it's a system that's built in Suresh's center at Brown, yeah, I think I probably would trust that they're going to have my interests at heart, and I'd be willing to defer some of my autonomy. Please don't abuse that, Suresh. So, I think that it comes back to this question of trust. Why do we trust physicians? Well, because we think that they have a fiduciary duty to us. They have a duty to put our values on at the forefront. And we think that there are mechanisms in place, social, political, and legal, to correct things when they don't, right? There's malpractice lawsuits. There's the ability for doctors to be sanctioned. We have none of these things right now. Tech companies do not have a fiduciary duty to me. They have a fiduciary duty to their stockholders, at least here in the United States, or to their investors. There are no practices or systems in place to correct things when they harm me or do something against my interests. So, I think I don't trust AI, but it's not because of the AI. It's because of the people and the systems around the AI that are why I share your view, Burkhard. I trust my doctor. I'm like, you're the expert on this thing. And I would not have that reaction towards the vast majority of AI systems that are out there in the world.
Yeah, no, I think exactly. I trust my doctor considerably more than Elon Musk. Joe, you were the next on the list.
Yeah, I really like the comment just made by David, especially finishing on I trust the people and systems around AI. It reminds me a lot about literature within legal scholar Helen Nissenbaum, where she talks about contextual integrity, and you want the system to be trusted. You need to adhere to what she calls contextual integrity, which means that. And the context is essential, which the point I made in the beginning, from which sector or which context are we talking about? To give an example of Anne also, or you also mentioned it, Burkhard, is that when you are in the medical field, especially in some countries where you have public health systems, that you kind of expect that they will treat you well, and they have a whole backlog of checks and balances and expertise you can't kind of trust on. At that moment, that's the point Nissenbaum makes, informed consent is not important anymore. It's still asked, but people really they know the backside of this kind of industry and sector, and knowing in general I can trust what they advise me to do, and they have no hidden agendas. They look out for the well-being of and not for the money they want to earn about it. So this kind of contextual integrity is quite essential, and this also connects to with the point about consent and in order to have trust, you have to consent and informed consent. You see this also how this is really weak in other sectors, like in digital marketing, for example, on social media, where you don't know the backside of this story. You know that social media are not social; they're meant to connect you to personalized advertising because their business model is advertising, and so this creates a kind of, okay, I should not consent, but I cannot. So consent has different meaning because there is a lack of contextual integrity in this other sector. So the whole thing about what are we talking about in this technology, but especially in what kind of context is this technology embedded? Is this in this, what kind of sector is it embedded, and to what extent has this sector, this context built trust already, has been accountable, for example, when things go wrong, that you can call somebody saying this had a bad effect on me, what's happening? You can't call Meta that your younger son had a bad effect by using Facebook or using Instagram because there's nobody to call. So they don't feel accountable for what's happening. So this relates a lot to, yeah, why or to what extent can you trust certain kinds of systems?
David?
Well, I just wanted to come in and quickly add. I mean, I think one of the interesting things that's starting to happen, at least I haven't kept quite on top of the EU AI Act implementation, but we're seeing in multiple countries, including parts of the United States, are policy shifts exactly, Joe, to try and address that, where there is actually, there are laws that have now been passed that essentially say if companies do not do the following things with their AI, we will presume that they are liable for the harms that result. So, my kid has an eating disorder because of their time on Instagram. Well, if Instagram has not taken certain kinds of precautions, there are now political jurisdictions where they're held presumptively liable. They don't have a defense against it. They have the burden of proof to show that they didn't cause this. And I think that's potentially a big shift because that now starts to create in the companies a very strong incentive to actually think about the impacts of what they're doing, not just the impacts on their bottom line and their profit for their shareholders, but impacts on the people using the system.
Before the next, so to connect to that, that's what I've written about cooperative responsibility. It's not only, so what you see often now, it's being put upon the individual as being, you just have to stop less using Instagram. That's your problem. While it's a shared responsibility, there are other stakeholders, at least the company itself, that have responsibility. Also, the regulators have responsibility. Also, different stakeholders are in there, and all too often that's lost out of sight. It's the individual who just needs to do some digital detoxing, and then everything will be solved. So that's a different story. Sorry, Rob.
Yeah. All very excellent points. I have Funke and then Anne. Funke?
Hi there, Burkhard. How are you?
Hello, I'm fine, thanks.
It's just been fascinating hearing all these thoughts around what trust looks like, and really, you can't get away from elements of relational trust, really, even though we're talking about AI. One of the things I was thinking about was the trust equation in this context, and how that has always really helped me. For context, I'm a general counsel working within the tech sector, so very, very immersed in all of this at the moment here in the UK. And the trust equation essentially talks about trust in terms of a number of elements. Trustworthiness is about credibility, reliability, intimacy. Self-orientation comes into it. Credibility is a confidence in the expertise and the knowledge. Reliability is a consistency in actions and promises. Intimacy is the emotional safety and connection. And then self-orientation is around the sort of self-interest aspect. Am I thinking about your interests over mine, or where does the balance of interests lie? And I think it's so important when we're talking about AI and trust that we don't lose sight of the emotional safety aspect. That's been touched on already in some of this conversation, but we can't get away from that, whether we're talking about the use of AI in social media or in other, I work in digital health, for example. Emotional safety is a key part of what we're doing, delivering for our patients, improving pathways. So I just wanted to mention that really, just to bring a bit of a slightly different perspective to what trust and trustworthiness means in this context.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And I think also a really important reminder. We started in a way with also with David's first talk with trustworthiness as a property of a system that tries to achieve something good, and increasingly then discuss what do we do if something did not go well, and how can we restore it. And I think both aspects are of definitely equal importance. And I think the trust equation is an attempt to sort of strengthen this first one again. Anne?
So originally I had my hand raised because I was going to go back to something that David said, but I want to first respond to Funky's point here. I think emotional safety is an important element, and I think one of the places that we're going to have to come to terms with it is in the use of artificial intelligence in education, in schools, particularly in K through 12. We saw a lot of new technologies put in the hands of young people when iPads came online, and every student getting a computer, but then without the guardrails, without the limitations to accessing information that wasn't appropriate for a third grader to come across pornography, for example, while they were trying to research something for their third grade class. And so we're going to have to be thoughtful about the choices that teachers are going to be making about how to use artificial intelligence for young people, because I think their emotional safety and their emotional health is such an important attribute of their ability, their capacity to be able to learn. And so, just a point on that. But back to David's point about the EU AI Act and the pendulum swinging back. I'm glad to see that, and I think the EU is providing some regulatory, or not some, the regulatory leadership in the space that it needs. But the pendulum that it's swinging from was a very specific regulatory choice in the United States that governed companies like Meta, and so prevented Meta from having to take responsibility for how a young person was affected by their time on their social networking platforms because of Section 230 in the Communications Act, which said that these companies were not responsible for the content that was appearing on their site. Well, I come from part of my background is working in a media company, a newspaper company in the United States, back when people still read newspapers. And newspapers could not publish things that they were not held responsible for. There were laws that held them to certain standards, and there was a code of ethics that journalists follow around their reporting responsibilities that they took very seriously, and did take responsibility for the things that are published in their paper. And so for these companies to have been given the permission to develop their products without that responsibility, that is an example of a liability framework that allowed that to happen. So I'm very glad to see the EU coming back in with some guidelines that are going to hold some of these companies that cross international borders to answer to a different set of rules.
How would that work with a printed newspaper, and if they print letters by readers? I honestly don't know. But because that is often the closest analogy you would have, wouldn't you, to sort of post on a blog or something like that?
Yeah, in the newspaper world, there was a very clear distinction made between the news part of the paper and the opinion part of the paper, and different standards that were applied to those different parts of the paper. And so the letters to the editor appear in the opinion pages and are clearly labeled as such, and therefore not based in fact, or have to meet the certain standards. And it's partly why right now, if somebody writes a letter to the editor that's inflammatory, has a lot of claims about somebody, a responsible news organization would not actually publish that in the letters to the editor, but would actually research it and report it as a news story and cover it in its news pages to make sure that it was being, taking that responsibility as a news publication seriously. So those choices are actually made. There are some times that letters to the editor are rejected and then pursued as news stories because they carry such inflammatory claims about
Which
somebody.
gives them much greater scope of choices than your typical AI moderating software would have. Excellent. Joe, you were raising your hand.
Just to second the point made by Anne, it's even worse that even very recently there was this discovered November this month ago that Meta as a company even held back evidence the harm their product had on children. So they found it out. They asked to do research, and they deliberately held back this information as to show how little responsibility they take on this regard. So just to make that point. So in that sense, I had another point I've now forgotten. I'm coming back and then forgot what I just want to say. Just coming back to that in a minute.
Yeah, and again, for me, that is one of these interesting questions. On the one hand, it is a good thing that Meta found out about that problem because it means they look at least for that sort of thing. The negative side is they then didn't act on it. From a legal perspective, we want to encourage companies to do the right thing or force them to do the right thing without creating any advantage of willful ignorance or willful stupidity. And that can be very, very tricky also from the legislator's perspective. Joe, you rememred?
I remember my point. No, in that sense, if you want to build trust, you have to take on some responsibility. But of course, as Anne sketched there in the newspaper sector and the media and the classical media sector, the difference is they have full control of the content they produce. So this also means they can have full responsibility of things that happen on their platforms and their newspapers and everything. It's a different story, of course, when you have platforms like social media platforms that not produce their own content for the most of the time, but have other people have contents on their platforms. And so that's a different kind of responsibility to generate trust. The kind of responsibility they have there is not so much on looking into the content and what's happening, but in their algorithm, not spreading things that shouldn't be spread, that shouldn't get a megaphone, that shouldn't be, and that's their responsibility. So in a certain sense, the labor division between where is their responsibility ends and where does it start again is more within the systems, what they do with what's happening on their systems. And for what reasons? Because spreading, for example, disinformation is very beneficial from a financial side because it generates more clicks and more data, and that's why more personalized advertising. So for them, the reason of doing something in that regard is not depending on having trustworthy information, but is getting money for their shareholders the next quarter. And this means agitating people, making people mad, and making something that people want to click on. And so that's a different kind of way of looking at what is their responsibility in this particular sector compared to, for example, the media sector.
Yeah. Suresh.
I mean, one thing that's worth reflecting on, I was thinking back to Anne's point about the news and the opinion section of a paper, and also what Joe's been saying about these different mechanics of trust, is that, I don't know the history of journalism in the sense of, I don't know how the news and opinion sections of the paper came to be, but I suspect it wasn't always that way. I know there was a time when, there was a very little distinction between what was said as claimed news and what was opinion, and there was a shift in the newspaper industry, I think in the 20s in the US and beyond that. My point is that, one of the things we know for sure is that the introduction of AI is disrupting a lot of sectors and a lot of processes and a lot of governance systems that we're used to having behave a certain way. And a lot of what we're seeing right now is, with the with the luxury of hindsight, maybe 50 years from now will be viewed as sort of necessary tumult as we try to come to a new equilibrium in how we work with these systems. And I think recognizing right now that we are in a stage of necessary experimentation, that we don't yet have a way of shoehorning these systems into current infrastructure. Maybe it can work, but maybe we also need to think about new ways of doing governance with these tools. And what that line is between new and existing requires experimentation, requires trying things out, and requires that sense of I know, adventure, I guess, as we try and try new ideas, that we can't expect that things will either work the way they are, or that we have to give up hope and nothing will work. We just have to try things out, and that we need to keep that in mind as well.
Which, in a way, unless there are strong views in any one of the audience panel or not, I think would be an excellent point to wrap this up, because in a way it shows where exactly the problem is. On the one hand, we know that these systems pose significant risk. We know that bad things do happen, but we also have a reasonable belief that things could be different, that there are better institutions, that there are better mechanisms that are not fantasy. We are not talking about Asimov's 3 law of robotics. We are talking about very concrete steps that we all can take to ensure that these systems really work in the way that supports human well-being, as opposed to just a small number of shareholders of these companies. Is there consensus that this is our final position? Because that would allow me then to very, very, say very much thank you to all of our panelists, to everyone who joined us today in the audience. I thought we had a really, really good discussion going on here with, for me at least, lots of new ideas that I now need to follow up in an already quite overwhelmed timetable. So I better get to my AI and tell it to write 2 or 3 papers for me. I'm totally sure that will be perfectly okay and nothing bad will happen from it. And before this starts again, a totally new discussion, thanks a lot to all of our speakers. Thanks a lot to AI4People. Thanks a lot to you in the audience. And I hope to see you all in different parts of your life.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Bye.